And I will post this to our Moodle page later on this evening. It takes a couple hours sometimes for this to all to cycle through. Depends on how big the file is. I'm going to keep on closed captioning because that's helpful to some students as well. It's helpful to me frequently as well. Recognizing that closed captioning is great, but it's not perfect. Okie dokie. So I wanted to start tonight by sharing my screen and getting to where our assignment is in Moodle. This assignment is due Sunday night. Take a second for this to cycle through. And let me make sure I've got, nope, I need to let me switch to the version that you all see. Okay. The assignment section is the section where everything is, including the places to submit your documents. So the MMSE assignment instructions are here. Here's the form and instructions for using the form, a sample of the written narrative, some narrative descriptions. Sometimes I think it helps to have vocabulary about what to use, and then the guide and the vocabulary. So what you're going to do is you're going to upload 2 files to this Dropbox here. First is the form and instruction side. I'd like to see the actual form. So it would be this form here with your written in sample. I'm sorry, your written in scores, and including the person's drawing here and then their sentence here. You will score them on the activity about closing their eyes and then folding the paper in half. Sometimes this scoring can be a little off. And I tell people, ignore the scoring for world. This doesn't even make any sense to me. So just give them a point for each letter being in the right place. So backwards, it needs to be DLROW. So every letter they have in the right place, give them 1 point. So if they have the D in the right place and the W in the right place, and these are not in the right place, give them 1 score for the D and 1 point for the W. Okay, and same thing for spelling it forwards. We ask them spell the word world. Now spell it backwards. You only score the backward spelling on this test. So a couple of places where you can take a picture of this and upload it if you don't have a scanner on your printer is a app called Genius Scan. Let me open that app. I love Genius Scan.
I use Genius Scan for work all the time as well.
I use it for work all the time. And you can get it on Apple, you can get it on Google. It is a great app and it's free. And I use it for all my documents, including my travel documents at work and that kind of thing. This will take a good JPEG picture of it. It converts it to a PDF and sends it to me as a PDF. So I need a picture of each page of your actual MMSE exam form, and please try to put this all in one document. I will accept it as uploading each page. Takes a lot more time for me to look at that, but do your best to use this particular app and upload your document that way. If you scan it, please scan it all into one document. So that's super helpful. So ideally, you will have one document for your actual exam. Let me get back on Moodle. Where did my Moodle go? I know Moodle's here somewhere. There we go. Ah, that's not it. There we go. It's right there. The other document you will have to upload is your narrative. And it's not like an essay, it is bullet points. So it really is just these specific questions that you're going to ask your client. And here's the sample. You're going to talk about appearance, affect, mood, movement and behavior, speech, memory, thought content, thought process, perception reality testing. This is about hallucinations, judgment and insight. And some of these things, the affect you can describe because it's an external observation. Mood is what the client feels objectively inside. Speech you can describe because you're listening to the speech. So thought content, and memory, giving her answers to the MMSE, like the short-term memory, remembering the 3 words. That's how you're going to assess memory. Thought content, we're going to go into more detail in the second half of this course, but it's the person having a logical thought content. Do their sentences make sense together? Do they have delusions or hallucinations? Do they believe odd things about their environment? Or do they talk about experiencing sensory information that other people don't experience? And that's a hallucination. So you're going to have to give some clinical judgment here about this. Same thing about thought process, and this is observed in disturbances of speech. So does their speech make logical sense? Are they able to answer the question, or do they go off onto some other topic altogether? If they go off on some other topic altogether, that's a disturbance of speech, and you would just need to say, Mrs. Garcia has some disturbance of speech because she went off on a tangent and was never able to come back to answer the question. Judgment and insight are also objective ratings that the interviewer gives. You can talk about judgment in terms of, can the person make simple decisions? Decision making is what judgment is about. Do they make good decisions for themselves? Can the person make simple decisions? And you can assess this from the MMSE itself. If the person cannot make the decision about folding the paper in half and putting it on the floor, or if they have trouble writing a sentence or deciding on what sentence to write, or if they have trouble copying the pentagon, the overlapping pentagons, or if they have trouble, they want to keep erasing it and doing it over, that would be a judgment thing. And insight is about, do they understand what difficulties they're having? Or do they blame other people? Or do they overblame themselves for their problems? Do they make a lot of excuses? That would be something about insight. So this is not expected to be perfect. This is the first part of this class. So I expect you to make a good stab at it and say something that makes sense for your interview. I expect everybody will interview an actual person for this, because you can interview a family member or a colleague. You don't have to have a particular client to interview, because I don't expect everybody to be working in this field yet. So let me ask if you have any questions about the assignment and the types of information that I expect you to submit.
I did have a question because,
Sure.
so for example, I'm going to be using my significant other
Mhm,
as the volunteer.
mhm.
Now, is it kind of similar to when we had you in our first class where we did kind of like role playing? Would they be role playing as well, or how would we go about
Yeah,
that?
they don't have to role play. I think it would be simpler if they just did it as themselves,
Okay.
and answering the questions legitimately for themselves. Some people will have significant others who want to role play, and that
Yeah.
can make it more interesting. It makes because they don't know how to throw the exam, so they're going to have inconsistent scores,
Yeah.
inconsistent kind of answers. But that's okay. This is about an observation. You're reporting out your observation of this person. So just describe what you observe in that person, but it's not
Okay.
necessary to role play.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions about this assignment?
So kind of just going a little bit off of Jocelyn. So I was planning to do my teenager son.
Mhm.
And so my question is, if he does fairly well, I mean, will that be okay too? Because I mean, I don't know if,
Absolutely.
okay. So I
Yeah.
was like, well, what does that look
Yeah.
like? There might not be a lot of issues or,
Right.
I don't know,
Right.
crazy observations. I don't know.
Right. My goal with this assignment is just to get you accustomed to asking these questions and recording the
Okay.
information. So if somebody gives you a fairly normal MMSE, that's fine. You will see people that will have a normal MMSE. You will see people that will have a one that indicates some impairment. And if you don't have somebody with any impairment this time, that's fine. I just want to get you familiar with the process and with asking the questions.
Okay. Thank you.
That's okay. My cat's right here. Asleep, thank God. The other ones are out of the house right now. Other questions that folks may have?
I guess relatively speaking, if we are using somebody who is probably going to do pretty decent on this, the judgment and like thought process is probably going to sound like it's normal, or that's
Yes.
going to probably be our record. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So we can have more questions later if folks want. Sounds like we answered the initial questions. Next, I just want to know, how's it going for folks in this class? Because it is a lot of information. And it's an important class because you'll need this information for your internships, and it is also information that you'll have on the licensing exam. That being said, I recognize that you're at the end of your first year in class, and I don't expect you obviously to be experts in this. This is a lot of technical information to take in, and it really is introducing you to the information and helping you learn where the information is located in the DSM, and also to help you learn some of the ways in which the profession uses this DSM information. So I just wanted to check in with folks about how's it going. I know somebody emailed me earlier today that they were having trouble with the links for the videos. If you're ever having trouble with links in Moodle, always try using a different web browser. Firefox tends to work best with Moodle, but it may be different depending on your particular computer and your internet access. So if you have trouble accessing anything in Moodle, whether it's a link or a submit button or anything like that, it's a web browser problem. And try a different web browser like Safari or Chrome. See if those work better for you. So how are folks doing?
To be honest, Dr. Levi, when I first started this class, I was very nervous. I'm like, I don't want this responsibility on me to, come up with a diagnosis, the symptoms. And then the first one with ADHD, every year my son gets like, we'll get phone calls, screen him for ADHD. And it's nerve-wracking, but I think the more I'm reading it, I think I'm getting more comfortable with it, but it was overwhelming in the beginning.
I certainly hear that, Sonal, and thank you for speaking up. It is overwhelming, and this week is one of the more overwhelming weeks, I think, because this is just the nuts and bolts of how to do an assessment, beginning how to do an assessment and how to use the DSM in one of the diagnostic sets that's more complicated. And it's also very common to look at diagnoses and say, well, I've had this diagnosis, or a family member's had this diagnosis, or they're screened for this, and what does it mean if I have this? And all of the cultural issues that come along with having a diagnosis, all of the social justice issues that come along with having a diagnosis, and all the medical issues that come along with having a diagnosis. So this class hits people at multiple levels, and it's good to just take a break and kind of break it down for each other and take a deep breath. Yeah, so thank you. How's it been going for other folks?
So kind of add on to that, I think it was definitely interesting because I currently I go to therapy, and it was interesting because my therapist is at LCSW as well. So there's been conversations we've had where I'm like, this is something I actually want to get into, and we've talked about her experiences, and actually I passed my past session last week.
Mm-hmm.
I actually asked her, I was like, I'm just curious, like what do you have my diagnosis as?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good interesting, it's very interesting to be on the opposite side, because like I know like certain things she does, I'm like, oh, I know what you're doing right now, like
Mm-hmm.
and but it was an interesting conversation, and we talked about like insurances and just different things. Like it was things that you've kind of brought up that in our first face to face, that like it was a good conversation to kind of have with somebody who's in it right now, and just so it's interesting. I think it definitely gave me a lot of topics to talk to her about, and like you know, we talked about my own diagnosis, why my diagnosis is this, or why it's other specified. And like when she's explaining it, I'm like I was, you know, yeah, last night actually I went through, when I was looking at some of the bipolar, I was actually going through and I was like, oh, let me look at other specified trauma. Like because I know that's my diagnosis. I went specifically to that one and I was reading it and I was like, this is me. But like, but also like, it's cool. I think it's, like I said, it's a very interesting situation for me to be in. It's kind of opposite, but also, you know, there's a different kind of lens to it. But I think I got a little intimidated because like it's really like dense, like it's really dense reading. You can't just skim through. It's a lot. Like, you know, there's times when I'm reading and I'm like, that didn't click. I need to read this over again. Like I need to read over a few different times. And sometimes the reading is a lot, but I've kind of, maybe this isn't the best way to go about it, but there's certain ones where I'm like, I'm just gonna go and pick through some of the ones that I feel like I've either, you know, seen other people go through or like that I'm slightly more interested in, because it's just there's a lot there. But yeah, that's kind of where I've been at right now. I do like the videos, just some of them are very long and I'm like, oof. But I do appreciate them. I like the different media.
Okay, thank you. That's great feedback. I appreciate that, Jocelyn. Thank you. So yeah, consume these materials in a way that makes sense for you, everybody. I try to use different kinds of media, print and PowerPoint and video, and sometimes chat like this, because everybody learns differently. But that was a great conversation that you had with your counselor. And particularly as social workers, every mental health professional should be sharing with their client or consumer the diagnosis that they're using. That is a standard part of practice now. You don't keep the diagnosis secret. You talk to clients about what the diagnosis is, what it means for them, the impact it may have for them on their insurance or their future job prospects. You know, I don't work in a setting right now that uses a diagnosis. We work with a certain sector of the population rather than a diagnosis-based kind of method. But I always have conversations with folks about a diagnosis and what it means and the impact it has on them. Some people will say, oh God, now I'm crazy. Or some people will say, thank God, now I know what's wrong. Or, you know, for some people it will be meaning making, and for some people it will be off-putting. And for some people it has impacts on whether they can get in the military, whether they can get a law enforcement career, or a career in the medical profession and certain parts of the medical profession. So it's important to have that conversation with your consumer, and you should always be transparent about it.
To just add on, sorry. Something she did bring up to me was that there's certain diagnoses that do follow throughout your lifetime, but I think a big one that kind of hit with me was like sometimes it's just where a client is currently. Because she said, you know, like, you know, a year ago, if I would have been seeing you, you would have a different diagnosis than where you're at now. She's like, sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean that's a lifelong. Other ones, it's obviously slightly different, but I think that's something that we probably don't talk about too much. You know, sometimes when you feel like you got a diagnosis that follows you, I mean, I guess in your history it does, but I guess that's something maybe stigma wise to know that like it doesn't necessarily mean that's forever where you're at. So
That's another excellent point, Jocelyn. Thank you. I warn people about the forever diagnosis, particularly in children's systems of care, because it has an impact on the child in a lot of different ways, including what IEP services they qualify for or don't qualify for through the educational system. So I think it's fair to update a diagnosis. Even if you're an LCSW, you may work in a system where the social worker doesn't give the diagnosis, but they have to have it from a psychiatrist or a doctor. I always advocate for the social worker to talk to the doctor and say, I don't think this child has this diagnosis anymore for these reasons, or this adult doesn't have this diagnosis anymore. Same thing on the other side. I just recently saw a gentleman who very clearly to me was experiencing PTSD, and that was not in his medical file. So I got permission to talk to a psychiatrist who was treating him for depression to say, he scored really high on this assessment for PTSD, and I think he has this diagnosis, and this is the approach I'm taking to treatment. You might want to consider it as well. Same thing goes for these different diagnoses. Almost all of them have the option to say in remission. as a specifier. And so it's important to get somewhere in their medical record that maybe they had a major depressive episode, but now it's in remission. They haven't had any symptoms for a certain specified period of time. So if it's in remission, put in remission in the medical file so that that follows the person as well to indicate that that's no longer a current diagnosis. And there are many not only diagnosis, but phenomena that people experience that are going to be short-lived. Bereavement is something that people experience very intensely after the death of a loved one, and they will no longer meet the diagnostic criteria after a certain period of time. That doesn't mean that they're not grieving the loved one. It just means that for the purposes of this big fat document, sorry, there we go, they don't meet the criteria anymore. And so it's important to note when the person no longer meets the diagnostic criteria for whatever that purpose is within your system of care. And I also see, oh, thank you again about commenting on the PTSD and ADHD article last week. I have a big fat personal bias around kids getting an ADHD diagnosis automatically from school systems. I think it's become shorthand for a child who doesn't sit in their chair and doesn't attend in the class, and that can be for all kinds of reasons. And one of the big things I've been an advocate for is to acknowledge the trauma that children have experienced, and to not and to look at a PTSD diagnosis if the child's being given an ADHD diagnosis by their teacher or their principal who are not licensed to provide a diagnosis for somebody. In one trauma clinic that I worked in, child trauma clinic, we automatically had to rule out PTSD with every child we saw because we saw kids who were from marginalized populations living in a poverty, high poverty area that had a high incidence of family instability and substance use and community violence. And so I want to see, is a kid experienced trauma, which has all those inattention and inability to focus issues that often gets misdiagnosed for ADHD. Same thing for kids in foster care. If a child is moving from foster home to foster home, they're going to be inattentive. They're going to be distressed in ways they're going to look like inattention in the classroom. And maybe they're not sleeping because they're in a new foster home. So that's why I'm happy to see social workers in more school systems now to help tease out that information for children. So knowing that's my personal bias, I have to be careful that I don't underdiagnose ADHD then. So you've got to look at both sides of the issue. Okay. Other issues that folks want to bring up about this class and moving through these materials.
Dr. Leva, I do appreciate you giving us the diagnosis worksheet to compare with because that helps me a lot. Then I'm like able to go back and like, oh, I missed this. So thank you for that.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's not a graded part of the class, but I provide it as a tool because once you get good at soliciting information from people, you then have to figure out how to organize it. And unfortunately, that's how it gets organized in my brain. So you figure out your own cheat sheets if you organize things differently in a way that's going to work for you. I just offer that as a tool, as a place to start. If you're a visual person and you want to draw it as a diagram and that makes more sense to you, or I don't know, figurative drawing too, if that works for you, that's great. Or color coded, however it's going to work for you. I've just offered this as a way to start. So I'm going to, at the end of each weekend, I'm going to post up my version of that diagnostic sheet in the discussion board, for at least one of the cases in the previous week. So discussion board is a place to try out your ideas for that and to share your thoughts with other folks in the class.
I really appreciated those too. I think not only just doing it, but then having yours to look at afterwards. I was like, oh yeah, I think I need to maybe go back to the first week where you like I watched the video on signs and symptoms, but still like the previous last week, I think was it Carlos.
Mhm.
I felt like there was things I put in the signs that were you put in the symptoms, and I was like, I don't know if I'm not getting this, but it was like it was certain things that like I thought symptoms, or I might not have been, sorry, it might have been the week before previous, but there were certain things that I thought like symptoms are ones that they're expressing, like they are telling us or are in their history, and the signs are what we're viewing, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I need to maybe get that a little bit better. Like, 'cause I understand that concept. It's just like there were certain things I put in there and I was like, I'm obviously, I don't know, but yeah, I do appreciate like the comparison and looking at that to make sure I'm either on the right track or not.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And same thing with affect and mood, right? Mood is somebody's subjective internal experience. Yeah, subjective. And so you don't know their mood unless you ask them. Have you been feeling sad today? Are you happy most days? Wow, you sound like you're really kind of on top of the world. How long have you felt this way? To get a sense, are they having an elevated mood? So yeah, affect is what you observe. So after the first couple of weeks, we're not going to talk about the signs and symptoms in mood and affect, distinguishing between them, because hopefully you will have enough experience distinguishing between them so that you can be clear what's being reported by the consumer and what you're observing, because there are some diagnoses that make that distinction. Okay. And I hear my spouse is turning the TV on really loud, so you might hear some of that in the background. The things we can't control, right? Okay. So any other comments for this evening? I think folks have gotten a good jump on the class. Um, anything else you want to bring up? Okay, so I'm going to talk about what to expect in the next face-to-face class. Again, we're going to do that face-to-face class all together in this class. I haven't figured out how to do this game. There's a lot of vocabulary in the second half of class. And because there's a lot of technical descriptions and definitions, we're going to take that Saturday virtual class and the whole next week to do schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. So we're going to have a game. I'm going to have you do breakouts for a game around vocabulary. We're going to watch, I'm going to try to get this video to stream well together. They're videos that I bought that were professionally done, but this was before HIPAA. And so they're actual clients, they're not role plays. It's very hard to do actual clients now and training videos. So these are some older ones that we're still allowed to use. So I've got links set up to some of the videos. I have the fuller video that I'm trying to set up to use through Moodle. So we're gonna view some video together. We're gonna do some definition game together, and we're gonna talk about the assignments in the second half of class, which include, depending on what choices you've made, the standard options are 1 psychosocial assessment and the exam, and some folks have chosen to do 2 psychosocials. Some folks are developing some alternative assignments. So we'll talk about what that looks like for folks in our next face-to-face class. There's also going to be another live session this week on Saturday afternoon, if you want to attend that again. Otherwise, I'm posting this up and folks can view this on Moodle. And I'm also going to have an optional face-to-face halfway through the second half of class. Just mainly in that one, we tend to talk about the assignments because I think that one will come a few days before the psychosocial assessment is due. So that will give us a chance to talk about assignments again and answer any questions folks may have. So last call, any questions about the MMSE that's due this Sunday? And any questions about class so far?
I just had maybe, I mean, I know it's obviously gonna go based off everybody differently, but is there any tips for us to kind of help to absorb some of these? I know, like I said, there's just a lot in the DSM, but is there anything that you have noticed across the board that seems to usually help students?
I would say the order in which you make sure you study things. So absolutely read the DSM material. For some folks, I've had some folks say I watch the videos first because that helps me and then I read the DSM. Or sometimes I have videos and PowerPoints. I watch that first before I read the DSM. But make sure you read the DSM because it's got information you're not going to get elsewhere. Then look at PowerPoints. Make sure you look at the PowerPoints and any narrated video I have. And then the professional videos, I think, would be third in priority. And then the fourth priority is all the extra readings. And most of the extra readings are 3 to 4 pages in length max. I don't expect you to read the extra readings, but they're there for you if you have trouble understanding something or if you want additional information about a particular area. And I think I said at the beginning of the class, obviously we're not going through the whole DSM in this class. We've picked out the diagnoses that most people will see in their work with children, adolescents, and adults. So by the end of the class, I really expect you to really understand attention deficit and know a little bit about autism spectrum. You are going to see mood disorders all day and all night. And you're going to see anxiety and you're going to see trauma all day and all night. So you really need to have these diagnoses down. The rest of them you will see very often. So make sure you get your head around the rest of the diagnoses. But for sure, trauma, mood disorders, and anxiety, you will absolutely see in an adult population, and in the children, if you work primarily with children, attention deficit, autism spectrum, and disruptive behavior disorders, you'll see a lot of. So if the DSM feels intimidating, which it is, just know that you're going to see most of the same thing over and over and over again, depending on where you work. So I hope that's a little reassuring to folks. Okay, well, great. Well, y'all take care. Have a good week. If you feel free to join us again on Saturday afternoon. If not, I will see you in the next face-to-face in about a week and a half. So take care.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.